I settle into my chair before every show the same way. Coffee on the desk. A stack of notes that somehow keeps getting taller even though the internet promised us everything would become paperless. Somebody walking past says, "Big night?" And I answer the way I always do. They're all big nights now. Politics has become the world's longest-running reality show. Every day there's a new episode, a new argument, a new clip that everyone insists will change everything forever. Then 24 hours later, another clip replaces it. Somewhere in the middle of all that noise, another debate exploded. This one wasn't really about a flag, at least, not at first. It started with a comment from Sunny Hostin about how there are moments when she walks into a community, sees American flags displayed throughout the neighborhood, and feels uneasy because, in her view, some people have tied the flag to ideas she strongly disagrees with. It was the kind of statement that instantly became bigger than the sentence itself, because once you mention the American flag, nobody hears only the words. They hear everything they already believe. Some people heard fear, some people heard criticism, some people heard honesty, others heard an insult. That's the fascinating thing about symbols. Two people can stare at the exact same piece of cloth and somehow walk away believing they saw completely different countries before anyone had even finished debating what she meant. Television, podcasts, YouTube channels, and social media had already divided into familiar camps. Then Bill Maher weighed in, and when Bill Maher decides he's going to challenge an argument, he rarely tiptoes toward it. He usually drives straight through the front door. I've always thought Maher has an unusual place in American politics. He frustrates conservatives, he frustrates liberals. Sometimes he manages to frustrate both before the first commercial break. That's actually a rare talent. Most people spend years trying to build a loyal audience. Bill somehow built an audience that argues with him constantly and still keeps coming back. Watching the discussion unfold, I realized something. Disagreement wasn't really about patriotism. It was about ownership. Who gets to define America? Who gets to decide what the flag represents? Who gets to say whether loving your country means celebrating it, criticizing it, or somehow doing both at the same time? Maher's response centered on that question. His point wasn't that America is perfect. Anyone who's watched him for more than 5 minutes knows perfection has never been part of his vocabulary. Instead, he argued that allowing one political group to become the sole owner of national symbols creates a problem for everyone else. It reminded me how strange modern politics has become. We've reached a point where people sometimes assume they already know your entire worldview based on a bumper sticker, a hat, or the flag outside your house. That's a remarkable amount of confidence to place in lawn decorations. Imagine trying that logic anywhere else. I noticed your mailbox is blue. It is. So obviously you have very strong opinions about monetary policy. No, it was on sale. That sounds ridiculous. And yet politics keeps encouraging us to make giant assumptions from tiny details. Maher argued that America shouldn't belong to one ideological tribe. Whether people agreed with him or not, that broader point became the center of the conversation, because underneath every argument about culture is usually a much bigger argument about identity. The discussion didn't stay there for long. It shifted toward polling, public opinion, and the changing political landscape. Maher pointed to survey results suggesting that some assumptions about voting blocs no longer match reality. He argued that attitudes among different groups of Americans don't always line up with the stereotypes repeated on television, especially when it comes to issues like patriotism, immigration, and the country's future. His broader message was simple. People are more complicated than political branding allows. That sounds obvious. Apparently, it also qualifies as controversial. Modern political commentary often depends on neat categories. Everyone is supposed to fit inside one. Everyone is supposed to think like everyone else in that category. Life, unfortunately for television producers, keeps refusing to cooperate. I've met comedians who voted differently from comedians standing next to them. I've met writers who agree on every joke and disagree on every election. I've met people who can spend 3 hours debating tax policy and then spend another 3 hours agreeing on the best pizza in New York. Human beings are wonderfully inconsistent. Politics keeps trying to flatten that into spreadsheets. The conversation eventually moved toward another set of remarks from Hostin. this time about voting behavior among some women. Her comments sparked another wave of criticism from people who believed she was making a sweeping generalization about millions of voters. Supporters saw her remarks differently. Critics saw them as dismissive. The disagreement became another example of how quickly broad political statements can become deeply personal. Because if somebody says your vote wasn't really your own decision, that's not just a political disagreement. That's questioning your independence. No one likes hearing that. Not liberals, not conservatives, not the guy who still insists he independently decided to buy the exact same pickup truck every other guy on his block owns. I'm expressing my individuality. Steve, there are 9 identical trucks in your driveway. They're different. One has mud. Exactly. Political debates often become arguments over motivation. People stop discussing what someone believes. They start explaining why that person supposedly believes it. That's much easier. It's also much riskier. Because explaining another person's motives usually says more about the speaker than the person being explained. Watching all this unfold reminded me why television arguments have become such reliable entertainment. Nobody ever arrives expecting to change their mind. Everyone arrives expecting applause. The audience, meanwhile, gets to watch 2 completely different interpretations of the same country collide in real time. One side sees warning signs. The other sees overreaction. One side sees exclusion. The other sees unity. And somewhere in the middle sits the average viewer trying to remember why they originally turned the television on, probably baseball or cooking. Somehow they ended up watching another political argument instead. That's America in 2026. You can start the day looking for pancake recipes and somehow finish it listening to 3 people debate the philosophical meaning of a flag. Only in this country could breakfast become constitutional law. As the discussion continued, Maher returned to a theme that has appeared in his commentary more than once over the years. He argued that patriotism and criticism don't have to cancel each other out. A person can believe America has serious flaws while also believing it's worth improving rather than abandoning. That's a tension that has existed throughout American history. The loudest critics of the country have often argued that they're criticizing it precisely because they believe it can do better. The loudest defenders often argue the same thing from the opposite direction. Sometimes they're standing closer together than either side realizes. The problem is that cable television rarely rewards subtlety. Subtlety doesn't trend. Conflict does. A headline saying 2 people discussed complicated questions respectfully isn't going viral anytime soon, but everything is falling apart. Now that's a television graphic, and someone probably designed it in under 30 seconds. As I watched another clip spread across every platform imaginable, I found myself thinking less about who had scored points and more about what the argument revealed. Not about Bill Maher, not about Sunny Hostin, about us, about how quickly Americans now assume the worst intentions from strangers, about how symbols carry emotional weight far beyond the objects themselves, about how political conversations increasingly begin where they used to end, with certainty. Maybe that's the hardest part, not disagreement. Disagreement is healthy. Confidence that disagreement can only come from bad motives. That's where conversations become impossible. The debate was still unfolding. Commentators were still responding. Social media was still picking sides. And somehow I had a feeling this wasn't going to be the last time the country argued over what it means to belong to the same nation. The funny thing about political debates is that they almost never stay where they started. A conversation begins with one sentence, one clip, one headline, and before long it's become a debate about everything else. That's exactly what happened here. What started as a discussion about patriotism quickly became something much bigger. It became a conversation about identity. And identity in America is never just one conversation. It's 50 conversations happening simultaneously while everyone insists they're talking about the same thing. Watching the back and forth unfold, I kept thinking about something comedians learn pretty early. If you tell an audience what they're supposed to think, they'll resist. If you ask them a question, they'll usually lean in. Politics has somehow figured out how to do the opposite. Everybody already has the answer. Nobody wants the question anymore. Bill Maher, whether people agree with him or not, has spent years arguing that modern political coalitions sometimes make assumptions about voters that no longer fit reality. One example he returned to involved polling. He pointed to surveys suggesting that public opinion among different demographic groups isn't always as predictable as television panels often assume. His broader argument was that people who are frequently spoken about as a single political bloc don't necessarily think alike on issues ranging from patriotism to immigration to the role of government. His point wasn't simply about numbers. It was about certainty, specifically the certainty that commentators sometimes have when explaining what millions of complete strangers supposedly believe. That's a bold claim. I've had trouble predicting what my own family is going to order at dinner. Political commentators somehow predict the thoughts of 30 million people before lunch. That's confidence, or caffeine, maybe both. Then another debate entered the picture. This one centered on comments about why some women vote the way they do. Critics argued those comments reduced individual voters to broad stereotypes, while supporters viewed them as an observation about social dynamics and political behavior. Regardless of where anyone landed, the reaction illustrated something important. People generally don't enjoy being told they lack independent judgment. That crosses party lines pretty quickly. No voter wakes up thinking, today I'd like someone on television to explain why my opinions don't actually belong to me. Most people believe they arrived at their conclusions through experience, conversations, values, and personal reflection. Whether they're right or wrong about a particular issue, they still want ownership over their own decisions. That desire is universal. Maher's criticism focused on exactly that point. He questioned the habit of treating entire groups as though they all think for the same reasons. It's a recurring theme in his commentary. He's skeptical of broad political templates. Life, in his view, tends to be messier than ideology. Honestly, comedy works the same way. If every audience reacted exactly alike, stand-up would be easy. It isn't one joke crushes in Chicago. The same joke gets polite silence somewhere else. Then, somehow, it destroys in Cleveland. Never underestimate Cleveland. They've survived enough. They're prepared for anything. As the discussion continued, another topic emerged that has become almost impossible to avoid in modern politics, the word woke. It's fascinating how a single word can carry completely different meanings depending on who's saying it. For some people, it's associated with awareness of injustice. For others, it's become shorthand for a broader set of political or cultural attitudes. When the conversation turned toward the word itself, Maher made an observation he'd made before. Words change. Language evolves. Meanings shift. Whether people like that process or not, it happens. Every generation inherits a vocabulary and then quietly rewrites parts of it. Comedy reminds you of that constantly. You go back and watch stand-up from 20 years ago and realize half the references need subtitles, not because the jokes were necessarily bad, because culture moved, the audience moved, language moved. The interesting part of that exchange wasn't simply whether someone liked or disliked the word. It was that the discussion had shifted away from ideas and toward terminology. Or sometimes people end up arguing about the label more than the underlying issue. That's a little like spending an hour debating whether pizza counts as a sandwich while the pizza gets cold. Congratulations, you've solved nothing. And now lunch is ruined. Maher appeared less interested in defending one particular word than in defending the ability to discuss ideas without becoming trapped by vocabulary tests. Whether viewers agreed with him or not, that distinction became part of the larger conversation. Then came one of the themes that seemed to resonate throughout his broader commentary: shared identity. Maher returned to an idea expressed years earlier by Barack Obama, that there isn't a separate America for every racial or ethnic group, but one United States. He argued that emphasizing separate identities at the expense of a common national identity risks creating deeper divisions rather than stronger unity. It was one of those moments where the discussion moved away from personalities and toward philosophy. What holds a country together? Shared history, shared values, shared institutions, shared aspirations? Probably some combination of all four. No nation survives on paperwork alone. Constitutions matter, laws matter, but eventually people have to believe they belong to the same project. Otherwise, every disagreement starts feeling existential. Every election becomes the end of civilization, which, judging by campaign commercials, apparently happens every 2 years. I don't know how America keeps surviving so many final battles, according to political advertising. We've been 5 minutes away from collapse since color television. The conversation eventually broadened even further. Maher argued that political movements sometimes become so focused on dividing people into increasingly specific categories that they lose sight of broader concerns shared by everyone. His criticism wasn't aimed at diversity itself. It was aimed at reducing people exclusively to demographic labels. That's an important distinction. Human beings belong to many groups at once: race, religion, occupation, family, neighborhood, favorite baseball team, coffee preference. Somehow, coffee preference might actually be the strongest political identity now. Tell someone you drink decaf. Watch how quickly they question your judgment. Identity is complicated. Politics often prefers simplicity. Simplicity makes better television. Complication makes better reality. Another point Maher emphasized involved class and education. He argued that economic concerns and educational differences increasingly explain political divisions more effectively than many traditional assumptions. Whether analysts agree with that diagnosis or not, it's become a recurring topic in discussions about changing voting patterns. His broader message was straightforward. People worry about paying bills, buying homes, finding jobs, raising families. Those concerns don't disappear because someone belongs to a particular demographic category. The conversation reminded me of something every comedian eventually learns while traveling. People in different states laugh at different jokes, but everybody complains about grocery prices. Nobody has ever stood up after a show and said, "You know what my biggest concern is? Adverbs." No, it's rent, mortgage payments, gas, healthcare, kids, rents, life. Those conversations sound remarkably similar regardless of where you are. Politics sometimes forgets that ordinary life keeps happening underneath ideology, while television argues over symbolism. Somebody is trying to replace a broken water heater. Guess which problem feels more urgent to them? Exactly, the water heater wins every time. That's not apathy, that's adulthood. And maybe that's one reason Maher's broader message continues finding an audience across ideological lines. He often returns to everyday concerns, not because they solve every political disagreement, because they're impossible to ignore. At the end of the day, elections matter, ideas matter, culture matters. But people still have to wake up the next morning, make breakfast, get to work, help their kids with homework, answer emails they don't want to answer, and remember where they left the car keys. Political identity doesn't replace ordinary life. It exists alongside it. Maybe that's something all of us occasionally forget. As I watched another panel discussion give way to another round of headlines, I found myself wondering whether the loudest arguments were also the most representative, or whether millions of Americans were simply living their lives while television personalities debated what those lives supposedly meant. That question lingered, because the next part of the conversation would move beyond political labels and into something even more fundamental. Not just how Americans disagree, but whether they still know how to disagree without treating each other like enemies. That, to me, was the real question hanging over everything. Not whether one television personality won an argument, not whether one viral clip collected more views than another, but whether we've quietly forgotten how to share a country with people who don't think exactly like we do. That's a much bigger challenge, and it's not one that can be solved by another panel discussion. One of the ideas Bill Maher returned to throughout the broader conversation was that political disagreement shouldn't automatically become personal condemnation. He argued that Americans have become increasingly willing to assume the worst about one another before a conversation even begins. Whether you agree with that assessment or not, it's hard to deny that politics has become intensely personal. Somewhere along the way, we stopped saying, "I disagree with your opinion." Now it often sounds more like, "Your opinion explains everything about who you are." That's a heavy burden to place on a single vote or a single issue. It also leaves very little room for curiosity, and curiosity used to be one of America's best qualities. We've always argued, write any history book. Actually, don't. Those are heavy. But if you do, you'll quickly realize Americans have been disagreeing since the country was founded. The difference is that disagreement didn't always require permanent exile. You could argue fiercely, then go have dinner together. Somewhere along the way, dinner became optional, the argument became permanent. Maher illustrated this broader point by criticizing the growing tendency to judge people solely through a political lens. He suggested that reducing neighbors, co-workers, or even family members to a single political identity makes meaningful conversation almost impossible. That idea resonated because it's familiar. We've all done it. You hear one opinion and suddenly imagine you've downloaded the entire person. You haven't. Human beings are more complicated than that. I've worked in comedy long enough to know people who surprise me constantly. Someone you assume is deeply partisan turns out to have nuanced views. Someone who sounds certain on one issue is completely uncertain on another. Real life refuses to stay inside neat ideological boxes. That's frustrating if your job depends on simple narratives. It's wonderful if your job depends on understanding people. Another story Maher referenced particularly caught my attention. It involved a liberal couple moving into a community where many of their neighbors supported different candidates than they did. At first, they worried about fitting in. They carried assumptions. Their neighbors probably carried assumptions, too. Then ordinary life happened, bad weather, a difficult situation, neighbors helping neighbors. Politics didn't disappear, but it stopped being the most important thing in the room. That's an ordinary story, which is exactly why it matters. The internet trains us to expect dramatic confrontations. Real life usually delivers something quieter. Somebody shovels your driveway. Somebody helps you carry groceries. Somebody watches your dog while you're out of town. None of those moments require asking how someone voted. They require showing up. It's amazing how often humanity sneaks in when ideology takes the day off. That doesn't mean political disagreements vanish. They don't, nor should they. Healthy democracies depend on disagreement. The challenge is remembering that disagreement isn't automatically dehumanization. Maher's larger point seemed to be that America works best when people recognize a shared national identity alongside their many individual identities. He argued that emphasizing only what separates Americans can make it harder to remember what still connects them. That's a conversation that reaches far beyond one television show. It reaches into schools, neighborhoods, families, workplaces, comedy clubs, airports, holiday dinners, especially holiday dinners. Nothing tests democracy quite like Thanksgiving. You haven't experienced political tension until someone's trying to pass mashed potatoes while simultaneously debating federal policy. Could you hand me the gravy? Only if you explain your position on agricultural subsidies. This stuffing suddenly feels very stressful. Humor helps, not because it solves disagreements, because it reminds everyone involved that they're still human. Comedy has always worked best when it creates a shared laugh before asking a difficult question. That doesn't mean every joke lands. Believe me, I've lived through enough silence to know that silence has its own sound. It's usually followed by me pretending I meant to pause dramatically, but when laughter works, it does something politics rarely accomplishes. It gives people permission to relax. Relaxed people tend to listen better. Angry people tend to prepare rebuttals. That's one reason I've always appreciated conversations where people challenge each other without pretending disagreement automatically ends the relationship. Those conversations aren't always comfortable. They're not supposed to be. Growth rarely is. Another recurring theme throughout Maher's commentary involved patriotism, not blind patriotism, not unquestioning patriotism. Simply the belief that criticizing America and caring about America aren't mutually exclusive. History offers plenty of examples supporting that idea. Some of the country's most influential reformers criticized America precisely because they believed it could improve. Their criticism came from investment, not abandonment. That's an important distinction. It's possible to love something enough to want it to become better. It's also possible to criticize something so relentlessly that people begin wondering whether improvement is even considered possible. Finding the balance isn't easy. Maybe that's why every generation argues about it. As the debate continued, another point emerged that felt surprisingly hopeful. Despite all the headlines about polarization, millions of Americans continue living side by side every day. They coach the same Little League teams. They volunteer together. They work the same shifts. They attend the same schools. They wave to each other while walking the dog. None of those moments become national news. Conflict is louder. Cooperation is quieter, yet rarely trends. But quiet keeps communities functioning. Perhaps that's the hidden story beneath so much political coverage. The loudest voices often represent only a fraction of the people living ordinary lives. Most Americans don't spend every waking hour arguing online. They're trying to make deadlines, roast children, care for aging parents, pay mortgages, plan vacations they may or may not actually take, but broken washing machines. Again, adulthood keeps interrupting ideology. Toward the end of the broader discussion, Maher returned once more to the importance of maintaining a common civic identity, even amid deep disagreements. Whether viewers agreed with every conclusion or challenged many of them, the larger invitation remained consistent: talk to one another, listen before assuming, question ideas without automatically condemning people. Remember that citizenship is something shared. That message struck me as more lasting than any individual headline, because headlines expire, algorithms move on, trending topics disappear. The habits people develop with one another endure much longer. Watching the entire conversation unfold reminded me why comedy and political commentary often overlap. Both try to make sense of a confusing world, sometimes through facts, sometimes through stories, sometimes through jokes that reveal something serious hiding underneath. And maybe that's the strange gift of democracy. It's noisy, it's frustrating, it's occasionally exhausting. It almost never offers unanimous agreement, yet it keeps creating opportunities for people with profoundly different views to keep having the conversation. That's worth protecting. Not because it guarantees consensus, because it guarantees the possibility of understanding. As I gathered my notes at the end of another long day, I realized something. The biggest takeaway wasn't that one person had delivered the perfect argument. No one ever does. The takeaway was that the debate itself reflected an ongoing national conversation about identity, patriotism, criticism, and belonging. Those questions aren't going away, nor should they. Healthy societies keep asking difficult questions. The challenge is answering them without forgetting the humanity of the people sitting across the table. Politics will continue changing. Television will continue chasing viral moments. Social media will continue rewarding certainty over nuance. That's probably inevitable. But ordinary Americans still have a choice. They can decide whether every disagreement becomes another wall or another conversation. Personally, I'd vote for the conversation. It's cheaper than building walls. It also makes Thanksgiving a lot less awkward. And if there's one thing America could probably use a little more of, it's the ability to laugh together before arguing some more. Because the story isn't really about one host or one commentator or one viral clip. It's about a country still trying to figure out how millions of very different people can continue sharing the same flag, the same neighborhoods, and the same future. That's not an easy story, but it might be the most American story there is.